Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She is a historian of education and research professor of education at New York University. Diane blogs at dianeravitch.net, and her blog is close to surpassing 37 million hits. And Diane, I made note of the new number when we started doing these in March. She was close to surpassing 36 million hits. And just in the time since March, Diane has had almost another million hits. So we're close to 37 million now. She has written 11 books, including her latest, Slaying Goliath. Steve Sutts is an adjunct at the Institute for Liberal Arts at Emory University, a position he has held in Atlanta for the last 22 years, and recently served as the chief strategist for Better Schools, Better Jobs, an education advocacy project of the New Venture Fund. Sutts served as the founding director of the Alabama Civil Liberties Union from 1972 to 1977. Afterwards, he was executive director of the Southern Regional Council for nearly 18 years, and for nearly 20 years served as the vice president and senior fellow of the Southern Education Foundation. He is the author of the new book, Overturning Brown, The Segregationist Legacy of the Modern School Choice Movement, which is currently available wherever books are sold. Welcome, Diane and Steve.
Well, thank you so much, Darcie, and thank you, Marla, and hello to everyone who is listening in, and I hope you'll feel free to submit questions to Steve or to me, especially to Steve. I met Steve some years back when I was, I guess, first going around the country and talking about the death and life of the great American school system. And I think I met Steve because we had a dinner with the Southern Education Foundation. And so I met a lot of really terrific people who are working for equity and civil rights in the South. And we're still a long way from getting there, but Steve has stuck to his goal and stuck to his mission for many, many years. I was very interested in reading Steve's book because his book, which is called Undermining Brown, The Segregationist Legacy of the Modern School Choice Movement. I'll hold it up for a second. Overturning Brown. Overturning Brown. He reminded me of something very, very important. I grew up in Texas, in Houston, and I went to a segregated schools. And I graduated high school in 1956. And my school board in Houston was one of those that fought the Brown decision. And the first I ever heard of school choice was from Southern governors and Southern senators. And later in life, when I became a historian of education, I realized that the term school choice simply was a stigmatized term. During the 1970s and 1980s, people associated it with segregationist, and it didn't appear at all. Now we see school choice everywhere. We hear it being hailed by the president, and we hear it hailed and promoted and advocated by Betsy DeVos, our Secretary of Education. And so Steve's book comes at a very useful time where we can go back historically and ask about the origins of the term school choice and why it should remain stigmatized. So with that introduction, Steve, I hope it's an introduction. It's my recollection of how school choice was a very, very bad term, but now it seems to be the hot item in education circles. And I'd like you to talk about your book and tell us why you decided to write it. And I'll ask you questions about it as you get going. Steve?
Okay. Thank you, Diane. I expect I would echo everyone's sentiment on this call that your energy, devotion, and intelligence in the field of education is an inspiration and an example for all of us. I've been for over 40 years in the South, especially. I too graduated from a tokenly desegregated public school. It was desegregated while I was a student in the 1960s. And it didn't take me any research, Diane, to know as I listened to the political leaders of Alabama, where, by the way, as my book notes, the first strategy commission on how to overturn Brown was established, and they issued the first report of the Southern Segregationist on how to defeat Brown. It didn't take research for me as I listened to the political leaders of Alabama talk about freedom of choice. We knew what that meant. We knew what its objectives were. And I knew some of its strategies. But what this book has allowed me to do is and examine very carefully the language and strategies of the segregationists at a time when a lot has changed and a lot has not changed. You know, Diane, today, the fact is that a white parent who wants to send their kids to a virtually segregated school can most reliably find such a school as a private school. And that hasn't changed. Brown versus that. What has changed, though, is that the segregationists of the 1950s and 60s set up voucher programs in the South in only 7 states. Today, we have 27 states, Diane, 27, that have some form of a voucher program. And when you add the amount of money, it's more than $2 billion of taxpayer money. And that $2 billion figure is more than any of 13 states in the United States spends in their state appropriations for public schools. That we need to have a context for examining how we're going to. And those that are getting taxpayer money are essentially being financed by the public and by the taxpayers. And that is an issue that we as a nation must come to grips with. And so I wrote this book to help us understand how both the language and the strategies of the segregationists, whom all uniformly have done the wrong thing, how their strategies and language are today echoed by the private school choice movement. I think what is particularly important to note is that we have come to believe and to remember segregationists, Southern segregationists, as people who were embodied in people like George Wallace, or Big Jim Eastland, the senator from Mississippi, or even earlier, some other segregationists who were rabid, overt, and bothersome in their style and language. They were clearly racist in all respects. What we don't remember are the segregationists who actually built the strategies to defeat Brown. Those segregationists were not the folks who got on television every day. They weren't the folks who said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, as George Wallace did in his inaugural address to Alabamians in 1963. They weren't like Governor Vanderveer of Georgia, who, when he campaigned in the 1960s, promised white voters, no, not one, and as he called it, Negro child shall be in a private public school. Those are the segregationists we remember, but those were not the ones who developed the strategies and the language that has given us concern that we may in fact overturn Brown. Brown, as everybody knows, I hope everybody on this call knows, Brown versus the Board of Education was the 1954 opinion of the Supreme Court, which outlawed school segregation in public schools. It did not outlaw private school segregation, because at that time, most private schools, almost all private schools, were entirely privately supported. And the 14th Amendment applied only to the government. It required equal protection of the law only for those under the laws of the government. And so the 14th Amendment did not necessarily reach the private schools in 1954. And that's why there was a possibility for private schools to become such an essential part of what was designed to defeat Brown. As I said, the first strategy committee of segregationists who gathered together to figure out how do we frustrate and evade, if not overturn, Brown, was in Alabama, my home state. It was convened by a state senator, Albert Boutwell, with the counsel of an accomplished segregationist corporate lawyer, Forney Johnstone. Johnstone had tried to career. He tried to help defend the Scottsboro boys, but at the same time helped develop an Alabama law which allowed the vagrancy laws to essentially arrest any African American who was not at work and to send them into the mines for working under the state supervision and for state funds. He also was a major opponent of the New Deal and tried to overturn many of the New Deal reforms, including TVA and the Social Security law. So he with the advice of Forney Johnstone, Albert Boutwell's committee led a strategy session in which they came up with 4 basic principles that they thought were the governing terms by which Brown could be frustrated and ultimately overturned. And the first was they got rid of all mention, wanted to get rid of all mention of segregation in the state laws. That no longer prohibit by law what they call mixed schools. That way, no one could easily see that what they were doing was in fact for the purposes of segregation. So they got rid of, their first principle was get rid of all of the laws requiring segregation. The second was get rid of the constitutional provision that was in Alabama's Constitution that guaranteed a right of education to all children. So the second step was eliminate any constitutional obligation, state constitutional or federal constitutional obligation, that a child has a right to education or that the state has to fund education at any level. That was their second principle. Their third principle was to invest school officials at the school level with the power to determine the eligibility, the admission, and the assignment of pupils according to essentially scholastic aptitude. In their words, so as not to lower school standards. In other words, give the educators who are running the buildings the ability to be able to pick and choose students according to what you think is their ability to learn. And the assumption there, of course, as we know from all the literature of the time, was that the segregationists believed that all Black folks were not able to have what they thought was the intelligence of a white person, and therefore any integration would lower the school standards for the white kids. And finally, their fourth principle was establish vouchers in order to be able to provide public funding for private schools who would be able to incorporate all of these prior three propositions into their own school operations. The fact of the matter is, that became the guiding principles of essentially of all 7 states that developed voucher programs. They developed voucher programs in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Virginia. And to one extent or another, after each of their strategy groups got together, and the segregationists looked at what they might and might not be able to do, they essentially embraced those 4 principles as well. And they became the guides for how state laws were changed in the 50s and 60s, and how voucher programs, for the first time in the 20th century, came into existence with public funding. So that was a major change at the federal court system at that time, which saw beneath much of this. So it took them several years, but by the middle of the 1960s or the latter part of the 1960s, most of the voucher programs and many of the pupil placement programs had been declared a violation of the 14th Amendment or of existing court opinions. Just to emphasize once again how much we hear in the segregationist language and strategies, the same principles and language we hear today in the school choice movement. Let me see, I have here, this is the preface to the law that Alabama enacted over the objections of, at that time, Alabama's most liberal governor, probably the most liberal governor Alabama's ever had, Big Jim Folsom. What that pupil placement law said in its beginning was to establish a practical school system whereby the state's school program can be adapted to each pupil's ability to learn. And what that implementation of that meant, that they essentially did not say they were keeping Black kids in one school and white kids in another. And in a few instances, they allowed a token number of Black kids to go over into the white schools. But it remained a virtually segregated system in the public sphere until the courts intervened. And of course, at the same time, the vouchers allowed the private schools to make the same decisions until they were declared unconstitutional with state money. So it was a pretty simple way of proceeding to overturn Brown. The fact is that the Forney Johnstone, who I mentioned to you earlier, he gave a speech in Alabama, and shortly after his commission's report was made public. And his statement he made is also worth remembering exactly. And what it says is, he said to the Bar Association of Alabama, if the 14th Amendment now says that a state cannot inhibit the freedom of Negroes to attend schools with white people, what does it say about the freedom of white people to choose not to go to school with Negroes? And Johnson answered his own question. If members of a race are thereby deprived of access to a school attended by the other race, the result is attributable not to the compulsion by the state or government, but by the free choices of free. That exactly because if you're interested in legal precedent, if you go back into 2002, a Supreme Court decision Zellman versus Simmons-Harris essentially uses the same rationale to allow for public schools to proceed without interference through the 14th. So we had a development in which finally we were able to dismantle, as my book documents, dismantle the vouchers and dismantle many of the worst pupil placement laws, and that then moved into a second stage in which private schools then had to start relying upon tax deductions and deductible gifts in order to maintain themselves as segregation academies. And during this time, what happened is not only the growth, the continued growth of the seg academies, but began a conscious effort on the part of those who were developing the private school movement in the South, a conscious effort on their part to begin to blur their segregationist origins, just as the strategy commissions had suggested. And one of the ways, frankly, that they did that was to stress that they weren't developing schools to evade segregation. They were developing schools in order to give kids a much better education than they would get in the public schools. And it was in this period when we had a rationale that began to develop, and that was that these schools may be virtually all white, if not entirely all white, but they were that way because they were sponsored by a to be also in its congregation virtually all white. And so religion began to be an espoused purpose for these schools, which began during in the aftermath of Brown, with many of whom were fueled by state funds through vouchers, and who continued with tax deductions and tax deductible gifts, claiming, of course, that they were there to promote higher standards in education. They were there to give religious education. They were not there, they said, to segregate students, although their student body was virtually segregated, if not absolutely so. And it was this continued in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, the United States electorate chose Ronald Reagan as its president. And President Reagan embraced this notion of religion as being a major part of what schools should do. And as a California former movie star and former governor, he could facilely state that he thought segregation was a thing of the past. And so people who were suggesting that what he wanted to do when he proposed for the first time by a United States president that we fund private schools with public dollars, he said that he just thought segregation was a thing of the past, and he was only trying to get God back into schools. And he thought supporting religious schools would help do that. So this whole rationale continued. It's noteworthy, and perhaps we can share that when the segregationists were their strategy commissions, there was also a libertarian economist by the name of Milton Friedman, who was developing his notion of how public schools, or what he called government schools, the White Citizens Council also called them government schools, how these government schools should in fact be disbanded and allow freedom of choice for people through vouchers, so that we would have a free enterprise system of education. Maybe we can talk about that. What happened in the 1980s is that for the first time, we had over 8 years a federal administration that was pushing the notion of funding private schools, largely unregulated private schools, through vouchers of one kind or tax credits. And I think the importance of that is for us to know that the fact that we today have 27 states with some kind of voucher program shows that those who believe, and some of them genuinely believe, I'm not questioning their sincerity of belief, those who genuinely believe that we ought to have a private school system that's publicly funded and is able to pick and choose any students that they want to have, those folks have a long game strategy. It has taken them 20 years, 30 to 40 years to implement what they in fact began to push for in the 1980s. And I think that's why we should be most vividly concerned about what's happened to the fact that we now have a majority of our states who have built what I call the scaffolding for a national system of publicly financing private schools that are unregulated. And as we move towards closer and closer with federal administrations that want to use that scaffolding to pump in federal dollars, and the Trump administration has proposed that in every budget it has sent to Congress, we understand that this is not about the old segregationists, although what they did tells us what are the consequences of what is being proposed. What is happening is we're emerging to have a national system of private schools that are funded by taxpayer dollars, and that is particularly frightening. As we know, the fact is that through beginning in the 1990s, we've had a real change in the nature of our public school system's population. First in the South and now in the nation, we have a majority of low-income students who are attending the public schools. We have a virtual majority of students of color who are attending the public schools across the nation, and certainly in the South. And we have had, since the 1990s, a fairly steady effort on the part of state governments, often run by Republican governors, to diminish or defund much of the public schools that have been operating. And at the same time, we've been building this scaffolding for funding a fulsome with public funds, a private school system. This is not, as I say, this is not about the past. It's attempting to give us some understanding about what's happened in the past, to understand both what's going on today and what are the consequences that may emerge. We have to understand that George Wallace wasn't the only kind of segregationist, and understand that everything that's being proposed virtually today was tried, rationalized, and developed by the Southern segregationists in an attempt to overturn Brown in this effort to build a private school system with public funds. And I think ultimately, and I have a favorite quote, and that's Justice Marshall's quote. in a case that he decided when he was still on the bench. And Diane, I'll end my opening part with that. And that's when in 1974, Justice Marshall wrote, Thurgood Marshall wrote, "Unless our children begin to learn together, there is little hope that our people will ever learn to live together." I think it's that fundamental and that important. And I hope all of you who are in this Zoom event tonight will find an opportunity to preserve our public schools, the democratic principles that we have a system of schools to recognize the potential and the integrity of every student. And we do not pick and choose who are good, who can learn, and who should have the privilege and the advantages of education.
Thank you, Steve. And needless to say, I have a few questions for you. The first I would like to ask you is about federal court decisions that overturn voucher laws. Where do they happen? What were their effects? And what legacy is there today of these decisions, to the extent they existed?
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that that we have a much different court system today, but all of those voucher programs in each of those 7 states was overturned by a federal district court or 3-judge from beginning in the early 1960s through 1967, and of course, one of the cases that was perhaps most well known was Prince Edward's County of Virginia, where they in fact closed the public school system, and then started using tax credits and vouchers in order to send white kids to private schools. And Justice Hugo Black of Alabama, issued the opinion of the Supreme Court that year, 1969, ordering that the schools be reopened and ordering that the voucher and the tax credits be disbanded, and they were. What essentially has happened with our jurisprudence in this field is 2 things. One is that the courts began to decide that people didn't have standing to enforce the law. Perhaps the most important case that came out of Mississippi against the schools, private schools, was a case in which the Black plaintiffs, Black parents of children, brought suit to require the IRS to do more than define discrimination as being. Essentially, the IRS at that time, beginning in the Nixon administration, held that the only evidence of a discriminatory school was one which did not have any Black people at all. And so that was one of the reasons that you began to see academies becoming virtually segregated rather than absolutely segregated. But the fact of the matter is, Dan, you know, as a reputable historian of enormous note, you know that while the South had all of these things like the white primary, which said only white people could vote, the fact is, throughout the South, there was always exceptions to that rule. A few Black folks did get to vote in the white primary. And so the point is that we never had in the South absolute segregation in all areas of life. We had virtual segregation. And what essentially the private schools decided to do was, if we adopt virtual segregation, then the IRS will let us continue to have folks give us money through a tax deduction. Well, the Black parents in Mississippi challenged this, and the Supreme Court said they had no standing to do so. And you may remember in the Arizona case on the tax credits, the first case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy's ruling was that the plaintiffs had no standing because he said tax credits weren't state money. And so there was they had no standing to bring the lawsuit. So standing has become a measure in which the federal courts have been able to evade dealing with what are clear issues of racial discrimination. Secondly, the problem we have is that we now, Diane, have a federal courts which has adopted Chief Justice John Roberts' perspective, which is that the 14th Amendment says you never consider race. You can't consider race even if you're trying to look at race as a way in which to undo segregation. Well, that's turning Brown on its head, as well as building the instruments by which to overturn it. So what's happened is we've had court decisions in recent years in which the court has held that even a school system that wants to a public school system that wants to deal with its problems of segregation in the schools cannot do so if it's going to consider in any way, even for purposes of undoing the segregation, if it acknowledges that it's looking at the issue of race. Well, in that context, as you can easily imagine, this whole notion of public funds going to private schools is something the courts have essentially used standing to evade, and in the most recent case has in fact said that we now are allowing religious freedom of the First Amendment to be a basis for maintaining a segregated system.
It sounds like we've gone down a rabbit hole. I mean,
it's Alice in Wonderland. It is.
Yeah, I mean, the courts in the 1960s and the early 1970s had a very different view of race than courts today.
That's right. And so what we have to understand is that the courts are not going to be the venue by which we stop this movement of publicly financing of unregulated, largely virtually segregated private schools. The courts are not going to stop that. Not this court, and not, Diane, in my lifetime or your lifetime, given lifetime appointments on the federal bench. But the court hasn't said and cannot say that it must be done. So that's why we have to engage the political process. We have to be able to get these state legislatures and keep the Congress out of the business of using taxpayer money to support these schools, which as a sector remain very exclusionary and are often virtually segregated.
Well, I guess, Steve, that if I were your editor, which I was not, I would have said to you, write another chapter, because you need another chapter to bring up to date all of this segregationist history and its relevance to today. And I know that you allude to it in your final words, but we are into full-blown segregationist vouchers at this point. And it's not just vouchers, it's also charter schools. I have been in states where I remember a visit in Florida, another one in Georgia, and I asked the state superintendent, well, why do you have so many charters? And he said, well, it's about, we don't want people saying, I don't want my kids to go to school with those kids. So they get to choose a charter where the kids look like them. So we have a full-blown effort to roll back the Brown decision.
Well, you know, this gets us back to Milton Friedman. What Milton Friedman, he's not single-handedly done it, but what Milton Friedman do, rationale, parents and others could simply ignore the racial impact of their decision and consider it simply an economic social choice that has no moral implications. So, you know, his famous, first famous article on promoting free choice schools, in other words, publicly financing schools that any parent can choose anywhere for any purpose with any demographic. That opinion came out in that article came out in 1956, and he drops a almost page-long footnote in his academic chapter, saying that it had come to his attention while he was working on this that the segregationists in the South were developing a system by which to use private funding or public funding of private schools and vouchers as a way in which to evade school desegregation. And he essentially adopted Forney Johnston's view. Well, some will, some won't. So long as we don't compel them to do either one or the other, then that's free choice. And that's what a free market system's all about. You know, the fact is that he believed that so much. Of course, he also opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as being something that interfered with choice, because you shouldn't require restaurants and public accommodations to serve people if they didn't want to serve them, even if it was for racial bias. So I think what we've had this long process in which Milton Friedman gave folks an opportunity to find an economic, morally neutral reason for supporting a private school system this way. President Reagan glossed it as being something that was in fact not related to segregation, but related to the freedom. Secretary DeVos have continued to push this notion that it's not about race, it's about religious freedom and giving everybody a choice. And their use of the civil rights language to justify this is an abomination.
I always find it astonishing when you hear a right-wing Republican, or for that matter, a Democrat, saying school choice is the civil rights issue of our time.
Well, you know, we need to remember, and I put this in a paragraph in my book, we need to remember that in 1988, the Right Reverend Jerry Falwell, who condemned Martin Luther King as nearest the devil of any person who ever walked the earth. Jerry Falwell by 1988 was saying, and he said this here in Atlanta to an all-white male, he said, Martin Luther King is everybody's hero. We've got to learn that the heroes that we believed in are being co-opted, as is the language that they used, to justify things that those folks were deeply and unalterably opposed. And you know, that's what John Lewis, my old friend John, knew that deeply. And if you got him onto the conversation about this topic, he would say that nothing broke his heart more than seeing Dr. King and others being maligned in their own time and now being used in their own words to defeat what they believed in.
Well, it amazed me. First of all, I heard it from Michael Bloomberg, the billionaire who was mayor of New York City. The school choice is the civil rights of our time. Then I remember hearing it from Mitt Romney in his platform. School choice is the civil rights issue of our time. And then, of course, Obama said it, Arnie Duncan said it, and then Donald Trump said it, and Betsy DeVos said it. And I'm speechless. I'm absolutely speechless, because you know, and I know, the school choice was the mechanism for segregation. And to call it the civil rights issue of our time is so upside down that I am without words.
Yeah, it is. It leaves those of us who grew up in those times speechless. I do think, though, that we have to be strategic about all of this, and I think, you know, I think and one of the strategies I think we have to we ought to manage, to implement, is first drawing some lines. One line strategically I would suggest we need to draw is that it, you know, whether someone is sending their kids to a private school or not, that's not the same as supporting the notion that ought to be done with public funds. In fact, when we tried to challenge in the courts here in Georgia the tax credit scholarship program here, which is now sending $100 million a year to the private, unregulated private schools, we don't even know which schools get money, or which students are entered, or whether they're even performing as well as they did in the public schools, because they don't have to go to a public school to get the tax credit anymore. But when we challenged that, two of our plaintiffs were parents who had kids in the private schools. They didn't believe that the public funds should be there. So let's understand that we take our allies on this issue where we find them. And if they're willing to support us wherever their kids have gone, their grandchildren, on the notion that we do not allow public funds into private schools, unless those private schools, in fact, are run just like the public schools. I mean, no private school will do that, because I've talked to too many headmasters to believe that will ever happen. But the fact is, we need to make that line. And then, as to the charters, you know, I think what we need to do there is to waken up folks to the fact that the charter movement is, in fact, simply a partner to the private school movement, and nothing short of that. I mean, Dan, you probably, I don't know whether you've been, but I have been to Choice Day in the Southern capitals, where the private school movement has the kids go to the Capitol to lobby for, essentially, for public funding of private schools. And in the states I've been to, the children who show up are largely children who've been bused there from charter schools, who are there supporting the private school movement. Now, anybody who says, oh, look, we're different, we're going to be different, we are, well, the first place they can start is by showing that they're not a part of that whole movement of having an unregulated system. And then we'll talk to them about how to run, if they're going to have a system, a school in the public system, what democratic principles they have to abide by to be a part of the system. And that doesn't include being able to pick and choose students. So,
Well,
we need to be, I urge folks to think about their own states and to figure out the strategies that are going to work there, because we've got a majority of the states that already have the scaffolding to begin to rev up a national, fully funded system of private schooling with public funds.
So the first comment I would make about this movement towards privatization is that there is now a convergence of research and studies that shows that the voucher schools are way inferior to public schools, that the kids who leave their public schools and go to voucher schools do worse, and that a huge number of them return to their public schools. But from what I've seen of the so-called independent evaluations, they try to hide the attrition numbers because the kids are not getting a good education. In the state of Florida, there are either 4 or 5 different voucher programs now. It's costing Florida alone $1 billion. And none of the private schools that get public money in Florida take the state test. So we don't even know how the kids are doing in those schools. But in other states where the kids do take the state test, we know they're worse off. So the line they use, in addition to the civil rights issue of our time, is that you can save poor kids from failing public schools by allowing them to have a voucher. But what they don't tell you is they're going to go to a worse voucher school. The voucher is not worth $50,000. It's not worth $25,000. You're not going to go to the same. I mean, Betsy DeVos lies when she says poor kids should have the same opportunity as rich kids, because the rich kids are spending $50,000 a year and the voucher is worth $4,500. I mean, give me a break. This is for a really inferior, probably religious school where the teachers have no training at all and where the curriculum is out of sync with the 21st century. So the whole thing has turned out to be a grand hoax. And it's ultimately, I think, about what you write about, which is overturning the Brown decision and finding a way for white kids to go with white kids, and to say we're saving Black kids by having all Black academies. It's just reinforcing segregation. I think the other thing that should be part of our conversation is that there's a good bit of research that shows the very extraordinary benefits of integrated schools. Mm-hmm. And I think about the work of Rutger Johnson at University of California, Berkeley, who wrote a book, the title of which escapes me at the moment, but it's really about the benefits of integration and how the Black kids who went to integrated schools grew up to have successful lives and to pass on their benefits to their children. So it's really a question, and it's the larger question of our society, about whether we want to heal our society or allow it to continue to be deeply divided, deeply unequal, and to have the inequities grow.
Right. And we don't have a lot of research on this point, but I would proffer that that the benefits of integration in the schools is a benefit that not only Black kids and brown kids, but also white kids reap. The fact is that choices are often made by white parents on an assumption that I think is questionable, if not downright wrong. And that is that having your child go to school with kids who have had less advantage than your child is somehow going to diminish their capacity to learn and to diminish their opportunity to get into higher education that will give them opportunities in the future. I think we need more research on that. We used to have some research on the benefits of ending racial discrimination in the workplace for white folks as well as others. And I think that the research will show, if it's ever done, that white kids can benefit from this just like the other kids if we have a system that desegregates our schools.
So Steve, on a last point, which I'll make before we open up the floor to questions, I have had this fantasy that when Arne Duncan became Secretary of Education, he had $5 billion to create a federal program. And he said to the states, what can you do to raise test scores? What can you do to open more charter schools? What can you do to fire teachers if their kids don't get higher test scores? And you should adopt the Common Core. So he had this list of things that states had to do if they wanted to get a piece of that $5 billion. And I've often wondered, what would have happened if he had said instead, can you come up with a good program to have actually racially integrate your schools? We would have a different society if 45 or 50 states were competing to come up with the best program to integrate their schools. But that's another subject on a different day.
Well, it's a good one though.
Okay, well, with that, I will take the opportunity to break in and turn it over to Marla. We have a couple of questions from folks who are on here with us. And if anybody else has a question, don't be shy. Make sure you submit it into the chat, and I will make sure to scoop up that question and send it over to Marla to ask Diane and Steve. But right now, I'll let Marla start with the questions that we have.
Great, can everybody hear me? Yeah, good, okay. Good evening, Diane and Steve. The first question we have is from Jocelyn. And Steve, she asks, how did voucher proponents manage to convince people and state governments that vouchers were needed because public schools could not produce the results that the United States needed?
Well, I think the major technique has been to find an exception that they could represent as the rule. Find an instance in which they could talk about one student who somehow in a public school system of 50, 100,000 was unable to get a decent education in that school, perhaps because of a learning disability or special needs. And often these programs begin in the States as very small, narrowed programs for special needs students, for example. Or in the case of Georgia, it began with a modest amount of money for students who were supposed to have been in what was defined as a failing school, and then given an opportunity to transfer. So it begins in a very narrow way by making an exception, contending that one exception is the rule for all students, all Black students or brown students or whomever. And then in the next session, it begins to move toward efforts to expand it, to enlarge it. And the original rationales no longer seem to matter. A good example is in my state here in Georgia, where we now have $100 million in tax credits annually given to private schools. The fact is that it was based on the notion of a very close examination of one school system and one school in that one system and a handful of students. And they had to be in a public school in order to be eligible. Well, the next year we got rid of that requirement in the legislature so that you no longer had to be in that school, a public school. And then the eligibility, it began to expand so that you could actually you send your kid with money in preschool to private preschool. And then it began, and so today we have this program where essentially your child can start in a preschool at a private school with taxpayer dollars from the tax credits and go all the way to the graduate from the 12th grade, never having ever seen a public school, much less attended one, and be financed by taxpayer money. It's a subsidy for private schooling. And unfortunately, private schooling is largely a segregated, exclusionary sector. So that's how it happens.
So Arizona is the example of that, and Florida as well. Arizona and Florida have very advanced voucher systems. And as Steve said, it always begins with, we need vouchers for kids with disabilities. And then in Arizona, they said, well, we need vouchers for kids living on Indian reservations. And then we need vouchers for military children. And then it keeps going on and on and on. And in 2018, the legislature and the Governor Ducey, who was a Koch brothers flunky, wanted to expand the voucher program for, I think, 30,000 kids. And finally, a resistance rose up among parents and teachers, and they said, we're going to take this to the voters. And they were up against Koch money, they were up against DeVos money, and they had many court challenges to try to knock them off the ballot, but they got the referendum in 2018, and 65% of the people in Arizona said, no more vouchers, no universal vouchers. I mean, and the irony here is, despite the fact that 27 states have a voucher program, wherever the voucher issue has been put to the voters, it has gone down overwhelmingly, usually 65 to 35.
Thank you. Diane and Steve, I think one of the other questions that it kind of, I guess, has a little bit to do with this, and I guess both of you can answer this. Diane, I'll start with you. Can we talk about the role of standardized testing in all of this? I mean, Diane, when we talk about the excuses that they use to give us reasons why we have to have vouchers and why we have school choice, a lot of times they revert that to test scores. So Diane, can you first talk about that? And then Steve, can you finish up after Diane?
Sure. There was a time when I thought that the standardized testing movement was just an accountability movement, and the choice movement was a choice movement. And then at some point I realized it's all the same, that what we have with standardized testing is a very ridiculous idea that if all the teachers were great teachers, all the kids would be A students. And there's no school in the world where every child is an A student. I mean, some kids are great at one thing and not great at another. And even in the same classroom with the same teacher and the same curriculum, there will be a variation in achievement. But you start with No Child Left Behind, and No Child Left Behind is like the template for all the craziness that's happened in the last 20 years. And that is to say that by the year 2014, and this was in the law, every child will be proficient. Well, there's no school in which every child was proficient. There was no district, there was no state. So if we had lived with that law, we would have closed down every school in America, because we did not meet the goal of every child must be proficient. And the penalty for not being proficient was to turn the school into a charter school or over to state control. So the two movements, which I once thought were different, are not different. They're the same. Setting ridiculous expectations is a way of setting the groundwork for charters and vouchers and privatization. And the charters don't do any better unless they cherry pick their students, and the vouchers do far worse. So but they're not held accountable. The vouchers are never accountable, and the charters are periodically accountable.
I think the only thing I would add to Diane's clearly on point, but the only thing I would add to it is that I think we have come to think of standardized tests as a measure of a student's ability to learn. It may, and in many cases may not, identify their current proficiency in an area. And I think there are a lot of standardized tests that do not, including the one that has been used mostly for admission to colleges. Mm-hmm. But we don't think of testing as a way in which to understand how to advance student learning. What we use it as is a way in which to group students according to how they tested on that particular test. And that is just wrong-headed. It's just wrong-headed. Sure, we have to have something by which, a portfolio, I prefer a portfolio of ways in which to measure students' proficiency. But we have come to use standardized testing in this country as a way in which to sort students, which often happens by race, rather than trying to use testing as a way in which to understand how we can further a child's ability to learn.
Okay. All right, we have another question from Marva Herndon, and Marva is actually from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she says, I am from Milwaukee, which is ground zero for vouchers. Any ideas on how we can get the attention of the Republican-controlled state legislature?
My first idea would be to vote them out, because, it's an interesting thing, and one of the conversations we'll be having soon, I think next week, is with Derek Black. And Derek Black writes about how public education was always supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. It was not a partisan issue. It was only with the advent of two things. One, the Brown decision, and two, the Reagan administration, that Republicans began to see that there was political capital in catering to white segregationists. But other than that, which is a huge thing to be other than, Republicans were not anti-public education. And I think that one of the reasons why Wisconsin has gone so far down the voucher road is that it grew out of an effort to segregate the schools, and also a kind of a choice zealotry funded by the very, very wealthy Bradley Foundation. And I'm sure the commenter knows the Bradley Foundation because they're based in Milwaukee, and they funded the lawsuit that made vouchers legal in Milwaukee. I mean, the thing that you have to remember about Milwaukee is that it has three sectors: vouchers, charters, and public schools. They're all about the same in size, and they all do horribly. I mean, by dividing up all the kids into three sectors, there's no real energy behind any one of them. And the voucher kids do no better than the charter kids, who do no better than the public school kids. And they all do about the same as the kids in the Deep South, in terms of the Black students in the charters and vouchers do about the same as the Black kids in the Deep South, who have a lack of opportunity and a lack of funding.
I would prefer Diane's remedy of getting rid of those folks who think vouchers. But if that seems in some cases to be more than you can pull off, in the beginning at least, I would suggest this strategy, if it's possible. I'd suggest that you find and I expect in Wisconsin they're easier to find than they are in Alabama or Georgia, but find an old school Republican who, as Diane says, believes in public schools, who either and build their support around running for office and supporting on a basis of supporting public schools, or if they are already in office, build a campaign of support around them. There is, I don't have a great deal of hope in public education returning to being a bipartisan issue around the country, but I think it can be done in some parts. The fact of the matter is, in the state of Mississippi, we have in the Mississippi legislature a bipartisan support for public education in this Mississippi legislature that is at odds with the Republican governor. I helped some folks in Mississippi support Republicans who ran on pro-public education agendas, and they got elected, and they're promoting their agenda. So in cases where you don't think you're going to be able to change the R and the D to a more support, then find the R that will in fact be a genuine advocate for public education and start there.
Well, I'd say that it's really important to kind of make public education a big issue because at least 85% of the kids in this country go to public schools. So it's not really a hugely politically popular program to say, I'm going to appeal to the 5% in voucher schools. I'm going to appeal to the 6% in charter schools. I'm going to appeal to the X% in private schools. Why not appeal to the 85% in public schools? That's a big number. And by the way, Ronald Reagan graduated from a public school. And so did Sam Walton. And his children and grandchildren support only charter schools and private schools.
Yeah. Our next question is from Michael Mobes, and Michael is from DC. And he says that DC has a lot of charter schools, and that the public high schools are considered some of the academic best, but they have competitive admission policies that do not admit just anyone who wants to come. What do you think about this?
Well, I personally think there are way too many charter schools in DC, and the Walton Foundation, which hates public schools, has supported most of the charter schools in DC. I think DC would be far better off if they built a strong public school system rather than diverting so much money into charter schools. Plus, that voucher program that DC runs has been a failure. Every time it's evaluated, the evaluators, even when they're pro-vouchers, say there's no difference in test scores whatsoever. So why does the Congress continue to support this year after year? It's a very small program, but it siphons off money from the public schools, as do the charter schools.
I think any public school that uses standardized tests for admission is a private school, and it should not exist. We have them all over. We've had a history of them all over the country. The first one was in Boston. The Latin school in Boston has begun to be challenged because someone finally did all of the statistics and found out, this has been a program for white students and Asian students alone. Hardly any other kind of demographic of a student has been able. And it's the Ben Franklin School down in New Orleans was a test admission public school. Touted itself as one of the best schools in the country, according to standardized tests. And by that measure it was. But it was excluding students, simply on the basis of a test score. That is not what a democratic system of schooling does.
Well, the test-based schools in New York City, and I forget how many there were 5 now, I think there are 9. They're almost completely white and Asian in a city where Black and Hispanic kids are the majority. And of, let's say, 1,000 kids admitted to one of these very competitive test-based schools, and it's one test on one day, out of 1,000 kids, maybe 10 to 15 of them will be Black or Hispanic. So it's clearly a racially discriminatory process. But they can't change it because many of their alumni are in the state legislature, and they like it that way. And the Asian community, which is the majority in all of these schools, is absolutely wedded to the test-based system.
Diane and Steve, we've talked a bit about how people can stand up against segregationists and segregation. And I guess my question will be for both of you, because sometimes we sort of need to see examples of that. So Diane, I'm going to start with you because you wrote a lot about some heroes in education that stood up to some pretty big people. Could you talk a little bit about a couple of people that we can learn from slaying Goliath, And Steve, can you also, after Diane's done, share with us maybe some people that we can look to for strategies and ideas of how we can also stand up to segregationists?
Well, not in my book, but right now, the major activists for desegregating our schools are students. And I've seen this in New York City. It's happening in other cities where the students in the high school are saying, this is not right. It's not right that we have an all-white school or an all-black school. And they're really agitating very hard for integration of the schools. But they're up against, they don't control the school board. Kids 16, 17, 18 don't have a vote. So they're up against a very powerful structure. I would ask Steve. Steve, have you seen movement for integration in the work that you've done in the South?
Well, it's spotty at best. I think what I would like to point out is a group in Mississippi called the Parents Campaign. This is the state of Mississippi. Mississippi, more than any other state, decided to use violence and intimidation as a way to try to frustrate school integration. We know, most people know generally its history of resistance to desegregation. Well, right now in Mississippi, the Parents Campaign, which is a group that lobbies the state legislature, has accumulated about 60,000, 70,000 parents across the state, African-American and white together, who are in fact trying to build what is difficult business, but rebuild the biracial support and the bipartisan support for public education. Now, I could go through various strategies they use, but let me just tell you that Mississippi today is a state that has a very small voucher program for dyslexia. And they were not allowed to spend all the money that the legislature set aside because of the governor's insistence. It is one of the smallest voucher programs among the 27 states. And secondly, they have only 6 charter schools in the entire state. What they have been able to do is build a focus on public education as being what it is that those parents will vote for or vote against if you don't support it. And I think we all have many issues. And I'm as concerned as anyone else in this country about the right to vote today. But the fact is that if we as a community of people start saying that I will give money and I will work only for those candidates who believe in public education. And you may, in Mississippi, that means there are some folks who believe in the Second Amendment, but they are now willing to be advocates for public education, and you make public education the issue on which you will vote, you will give money, you will give time, it has results. And that's what the Parents Campaign down there is doing. And I think it's an example of, especially in a state like Mississippi, where you would think, given its politics, as the state with the 3rd highest voting support for President Trump, they'd be all for vouchers and all for public charter schools. But they have been minimally involved in either movement. And it's because of what that kind of organizing among parents has produced over time. It doesn't happen in one legislative session. And I offer you that as an example. They also have the Parents for Public Schools in Mississippi, which works on integrated schooling and is a partner to the Parents Campaign. These are the things that just, it's, for those of us who in our college days got out and started tutorial programs for kids and did voter registration programs. It's just getting out there and organizing folks. It's an old-fashioned organizing need.
Thank you.
Well, that's an inspiring story, Steve, particularly because a state like Mississippi, which is a poor state, really can't afford to support 2 or 3 different school systems.
That's right.
It just makes a whole lot more sense to have a public education system where the legislature feels some obligation to support it, as opposed to taking money away from it for alternatives.
Well, Diane, we have 5 more minutes, so I'll let you sort of take over and ask any questions that you think we haven't covered, or wrap it up a little bit for us if you.
Okay. Well, I guess, Steve, the question I would ask you is that if Betsy DeVos were here tonight, what advice would you give her? She's had a lifelong passion for school choice, and now that she's the Secretary of Education, what can you advise Betsy?
I would advise her to resign today.
Good advice. I like that.
You know, Secretary DeVos has had a devout religious dedication to putting kids in religious schools, regardless of their racial composition and regardless of how well they're educated. I have no problem with religious education. My old science teacher in high school used to say, when we were taking a test, if you sit there and pray long enough, it might come to you, but it'd probably come to you better if you studied on it. And I generally hold to that general view about religious education. But the fact is that we just have to realize that we can have a private system of education in this country, but it cannot have public support. It cannot have public dollars. And her willingness to merge the public and the private is, I think, in many ways symbolic of what's happened in our nation's understanding of the First Amendment. When I was coming up, and you were too, Diane, the courts began to enforce what was called the Jeffersonian notion of the wall of separation between church and state. And most good old-fashioned Baptists in the South had been advocating for that for decades, if not centuries. Today, what we have is the notion that religious freedom means that anyone can do anything and the government should support it. They should be able to have their schools supported. They should be able to take tax credits and vouchers and have religious education. And that's because they believe that their faith should have the freedom. Well, I'm perfectly satisfied with religious freedom so long as it is private. The government has no business picking and choosing or allowing us to decide that religion is something that the government supports. So fundamentally, the Secretary of Education and I differ on the First Amendment. But I think my best advice is still my first advice: just resign, go home.
Well,
Diane,
you know, one more word. This conversation has been sponsored by the Network for Public Education, and one of the partners that we have worked with over the years, or the last few years, has been Pastors for Texas Children. And its leader, Charles Foster Johnson, is Baptist, and he has gathered in Texas some 2,000 ministers, not all Baptists, but people who do believe in separation of church and state. He's created organizations in Oklahoma and North Carolina and a few other states.
And Mississippi.
In Mississippi, people who believe that the way to protect religious liberty is to keep religion and the state separate. That once you merge the two, you sacrifice religious liberty. So we're very much on the same page. That separation of church and state is absolutely basic to our notion of education and of government, and keeping the government out of the schools and keeping them apart. So we agree with you. And I also say I agree with you that if I had my wish, Betsy DeVos would resign. The only thing that would concern me would be that she would be replaced by someone far worse. And at least with Betsy DeVos, everybody understands where she stands, and that's in a curious way been good for our cause, because it awakens people to the danger of merging church and state.
Well, I want to thank you both, obviously, for the conversation tonight, and also for bringing it around to Betsy DeVos, because one of our participants tonight, Robert Shepard, his only question was, which one of you will accept a position as Secretary of Education in a Biden administration? And he says, one can dream, right? So that was a very good segue for me to be able to include Robert's fantastic comment. So thank you both, Diane and Steve, for all your amazing work and insights this evening. I think it was a really fascinating conversation, and we'll get the video up as quickly as we can tomorrow, both on social media and on our website. And we invite you both, invite everyone to come back next week to join Diane in a conversation with Derek Black about his new book, Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. So thanks everyone for being here tonight, and we hope to see you next week. Good night, Diane. Good night, Steve. Good night, Marla. And Carol has joined us for the last few minutes. So good night, Carol, and good night, everyone. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Darcie, and thank you, Marla. And thank you, Steve.
Good night, all.